The autumn wind swept across the lonely outpost of Silver Ridge in September 1873, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant promise of winter. The fort stood as a solitary beacon of civilization amid the untamed wilderness of Montana Territory, a collection of wooden buildings huddled behind timber walls that had seen better days. Here at the edge of the known world, the law was whatever Captain Morgan Hayes said it was, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Have you ever felt invisible? Like the whole world looked right through you, not because you were small, but because they chose not to see? The first light of dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside the fort's kitchen, where shadows still clung to the corners, Clara Whitmore stirred a massive iron pot that would feed the garrison that morning. Her hands, calloused and scarred from 3 years of relentless labor, moved with practiced efficiency through the thick oatmeal. Sweat dripped from her brow despite the morning chill. At 24 years old, she carried 260 pounds on her 5'6" frame, a fact that made her the subject of endless mockery among the younger soldiers. A voice rang out from beyond the kitchen door, crude and cutting. "Hey, fat pig! Where is the bread? You working or sleeping in there?" Clara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her hands continued their work, kneading dough with methodical precision. 3 years had taught her that silence was survival. Responding only brought more scorn, more laughter, more pain that she had learned to swallow like bitter medicine. This was Clara Whitmore. Every day, she cooked 200 meals. She hauled 40 buckets of water from the well, each one a battle against gravity and her aching knees. She chopped enough firewood to keep 80 men warm through the Montana nights that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. The work she did kept the entire fort alive. But no one saw her. They only saw a body they could ridicule. The morning routine began as it always did. Clara carried a wooden tray laden with bread and bacon across the compound, her steps slow and labored. Her knees protested with each movement, swollen from years of carrying weight up and down the fort's steep stairs. As she crossed the dusty yard, a group of young soldiers watched her approach, their faces already twisting into cruel grins. "Make way!" one of them shouted. "Earthquake coming through!" Laughter erupted. Another soldier began stomping his feet in rhythm with her steps, each impact sending up small clouds of dust. The mockery was so familiar it barely registered anymore. Clara kept her eyes down, focused on not spilling the tray, on making herself as small as someone her size could be. But then her foot caught on a stone she hadn't seen. The tray tilted and a pot of hot water splashed across the ground, steam rising in angry clouds. Clara stumbled but caught herself, her face burning with humiliation as the laughter grew louder. "Careful! The fat sow's gonna crush us all. She's so heavy she can't even see her own feet." Clara knelt to clean up the mess, her hands shaking. This was her life. This had always been her life. She had learned to make herself invisible, to move through the fort like a ghost, hoping that if she stayed quiet enough, small enough in spirit if not in body, maybe the cruelty would stop. It never did. But sometimes one moment of courage can change everything. And that moment was about to arrive for Clara Whitmore. The sound of wagon wheels on hard-packed earth cut through the morning air. Every head in the compound turned toward the main gate as a lone wagon emerged from the forest trail, pulled by two massive horses with coats that gleamed like polished mahogany. Behind the wagon, piled high and secured with rope, lay dozens of animal pelts. Bear hides, wolf furs, and the distinctive silvery sheen of fox pelts caught the morning light. On the wagon seat sat a man who looked carved from the mountains themselves. Tobias Blackwell, called Bear by those who knew him in the high country, stood 6'3" and carried 240 pounds of muscle hardened by 7 winters in the wilderness. His beard, thick and dark as storm clouds, covered half his face, and his hair hung past his shoulders, bound back with leather cord. He wore a coat of tanned deerskin, stained with mud and old blood, and his hands gripped the reins with the casual strength of someone who had wrestled with nature and survived. But it was his eyes that held you. Gray as winter sky in May, they carried the quiet watchfulness of a man who had learned to read danger in the rustle of leaves and the shift of shadows. A scar ran down his left cheek from temple to jaw, a memento from a grizzly bear that had taught him the price of carelessness. Tobias brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down with the easy grace of someone completely at home in his own skin. He stretched, joints popping, after the long ride down from the mountains, and surveyed the fort with those penetrating, steel-colored gaze. This was a man who had chosen solitude over society, who had found peace in places where one wrong step meant death. And he had his reasons. Clara, still on her knees cleaning up the spilled water, didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on her task, too practiced at making herself invisible. But then she reached for a cloth she'd left on a nearby barrel and misjudged the distance. Her hand swept the cloth onto the ground, and as she leaned to retrieve it, she lost her balance. She fell hard onto her side and the bucket of dirty water she'd been using tipped over, soaking her dress and spreading a dark stain across the dirt. The laughter that followed was immediate and merciless. "There she goes! Timber! Someone get a rope and pulley. We'll need it to get her up." Clara lay there for a moment, the humiliation so complete she couldn't move. Tears threatened, but she forced them back. She had learned long ago that tears only made it worse. She pressed her hands against the ground, preparing to push herself up, when a shadow fell across her. A hand entered her field of vision, large, calloused, with scars across the knuckles. "Let me help," a voice said, deep as thunder in distant mountains, but gentle. Clara looked up into Tobias Blackwell's face. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. No one had offered to help her in 3 years. No one had even acknowledged her struggles beyond using them as entertainment. "I don't need help," she said automatically, the words coming from years of learned self-reliance born from isolation. "I'm used to it." Tobias didn't move his hand. Being used to something doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Something in his tone, a quiet respect she hadn't heard directed at her in so long, made her reach up. His hand closed around hers, firm and warm, and he lifted her to her feet with an ease that spoke of tremendous strength held under perfect control. His palm was rough against hers, cracked and weathered from exposure to mountain winters that could freeze skin to metal. For 2 seconds, their hands remained clasped. In those 2 seconds, Clara felt something she thought she'd lost forever. She felt seen. "Thank you," she whispered. Tobias nodded once, then bent to pick up her bucket. He handed it to her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he understood that sudden gestures might frighten her. Then he walked away toward the fort commander's office, leaving Clara standing alone in the yard with her heart beating faster than it had in years. Behind her, the laughter had stopped. The soldiers who had mocked her now exchanged confused glances. Something had shifted in the air, something none of them quite understood. A mountain man, someone who lived by strength and survival instinct, had shown kindness to the woman they treated as less than human. It was a small thing, but small things can crack foundations. An hour later, Claire worked in the kitchen, preparing the midday meal. Her hands moved through familiar tasks, cutting vegetables, stirring pots, checking the temperature of the ovens built into the stone wall. But her mind kept returning to that moment in the yard. The feel of Tobias Blackwell's hand. The way he looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear someone enter until a voice spoke behind her. "Smells good." Clara spun around, nearly dropping her knife. Tobias stood in the doorway, having to duck his head to fit his considerable height under the frame. In the confined space of the kitchen, he seemed even larger, a force of nature compressed into human form. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't hear you come in. Do you need something? I can bring food to your quarters when it's ready." "Not hungry yet," Tobias said. He moved to the small wooden table near the fireplace and sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. "Came to get away from the noise. Those soldiers talk a lot, say very little worth hearing." Clara returned to her work, hyper-aware of his presence. No one ever came to the kitchen just to sit. It was her domain, the one place she could exist without being observed. Having someone here, especially him, felt strange. Not unwelcome, but strange. Minutes passed in silence. Clara finished chopping carrots and moved them to the pot. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic thunk of her knife against the cutting board. It was a comfortable silence, she realized. Not the heavy silence of judgment or the charged silence before an insult. Just quiet. Been here long? Tobias asked eventually. 3 years, Clara replied without turning around. Since my father died of consumption, I needed work. The fort needed a cook. 3 years is a long time in a place like this. It's work. It's survival. Tobias was quiet for a moment. In the mountains, he said, his voice taking on a contemplative quality, a bear doesn't mock a deer for being different. A wolf doesn't laugh at an elk's size. Everything just is what it is. Strong or weak, fast or slow, you survive or you don't. There's no judgment in it, just existence. Clara's hands stilled. She turned to look at him. Why are you telling me this? Because down here, among people, everyone judges everything. They measure worth by standards that don't matter for survival, don't matter for anything real. Those wolf-like eyes held hers. In the mountains, survival isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance. The strongest tree isn't the tallest, it's the one that bends with the wind but doesn't break. You proved your worth. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. I don't feel strong. You're here, Tobias said simply. After 3 years of what I saw out there this morning, you're still here. Still working, still standing. That's strength. For the first time in 3 years, Clara felt tears that weren't from pain or humiliation. These were different. These came from being acknowledged, from having someone recognize what it cost her to wake up every day and face the cruelty that awaited her. She turned back to the stove before Tobias could see her cry. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. No one has ever said anything like that to me. Then everyone's been blind, Tobias replied. I may live alone, but I learned to see clearly in the mountains. You have to, or you die. And I see you, Clara Whitmore. I see someone stronger than most men I've known. The words settled over her like a warm blanket. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Tobias stood, the chair scraping against the floor. I'll leave you to your work. But if you need anything, anything at all, you tell me. A debt's been paid forward to me over the years by men who saw I needed help. Time I paid it forward again. He left as quietly as he'd come, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen with her hands shaking and her heart full of something she couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of belief that perhaps she wasn't as invisible as she'd thought. That afternoon, as the sun climbed toward its peak, Clara carried food to the officers' mess. Her usual route took her past the fort's storage buildings, and as she approached, she saw Corporal Duncan Reed leaning against a post. Duncan was 35, with a scar across his forehead and a reputation for cruelty that made even other soldiers uncomfortable. He'd made Clara's life particularly miserable over the past 3 years, finding new and creative ways to humiliate her. Well, well, Duncan said as Clara approached. Here comes the livestock. You bring our feed, pig? Clara kept her eyes down. Yes, Corporal. Fresh bread and stew. Duncan stepped in front of her, blocking her path. You know what? I don't think I want food touched by something as disgusting as you. Makes me lose my appetite. He reached out and deliberately knocked the tray from her hands. The wooden plates shattered, stew splashing across the ground, bread rolling in the dirt. Clara stared at the mess, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Oops, Duncan said, grinning. Better clean that up, pig. Can't have you wasting food. Not when you eat enough for 10 men already. The other soldiers with Duncan laughed. Clara knelt to begin collecting the broken pieces, her face burning. This was normal. This was what she expected. She would clean it up, make more food, and tomorrow it would happen again. This was her life. That was unnecessary. The voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Clara looked up to see Tobias Blackwell standing 10 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He must have been nearby, perhaps trading with the quartermaster. His face showed no anger, no rage, but something in his stillness, in the set of his shoulders, radiated danger. Duncan turned, his grin fading slightly. This doesn't concern you, mountain man. Tobias walked forward until he stood directly in front of Duncan. The corporal was a big man by normal standards, but next to Tobias he looked small. You ever walked through snow 3 feet deep in 20 below zero weather? You ever carried 80 pounds of pelts down a mountain for 15 miles without stopping? You ever gone 3 days without food because the hunting was bad and there was no one to help you? Duncan shifted uncomfortably. What's that got to do with anything? You called her weak. You mock her size, but you don't know what strength is. Tobias's voice remained level, conversational even, which somehow made it more intimidating. Strength isn't knocking food from someone's hands because you know they can't fight back. That's cowardice. You calling me a coward? I'm saying that woman has more strength in her smallest finger than you've shown in your entire life. She gets up every day knowing she'll face men like you. She does her work, keeps her head down, and survives. That's real strength. What you just did, that's the action of someone who needs to hurt others to feel powerful. In the mountains, men like you die first. Because when real danger comes, you fold. The compound had gone silent. Soldiers were gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Duncan's face had turned red, but he didn't move. Something in Tobias's eyes, that wolfish watchfulness of a predator assessing prey, kept him frozen. Tobias turned to Clara and offered his hand again. Come on, I'll help you. Clara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Then, to her amazement, Tobias knelt and began picking up the broken dishes himself. A mountain man, someone these soldiers saw as barely civilized, was cleaning up the mess while they watched. One by one, shame began to color the faces of the watching men. Private Jimmy Chen, a 19-year-old who had joined Duncan in mocking Clara many times, stepped forward and knelt to help. Then another soldier joined, then another. Within moments, 6 men were on their knees collecting the spilled food while Duncan stood alone, his face a mask of humiliated rage. When the ground was clean, Tobias stood and looked at Clara. You'll need to make more food. Ah, my negus. I'll help you carry it when it's ready. No one will bother you while I'm around. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, and somehow that made it more powerful than any warning could have been. As Clara walked back to the kitchen with Tobias beside her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt protected. That evening, after the dinner service was complete and the dishes washed, Clara stepped outside the kitchen for a rare moment of rest. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. She sat on a wooden crate, her aching knees grateful for the relief, and watched the day fade. Footsteps approached, and she turned to see Tobias walking toward her. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Brought you something, he said, sitting down on a crate across from her. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small pistol, no longer than her forearm. It's a .38 caliber, light, easy to use. I bought it in town this morning. It's yours. Clara stared at the weapon. I can't accept this. I don't even know how to shoot. Then I'll teach you. Tomorrow evening, if you're willing. Tobias's expression was serious. I saw how Duncan looked at you after what happened today. Men like him don't forget humiliation. They wait for chances to get even. You need to be able to defend yourself. I'm not a fighter, Clara said quietly. I never have been. Fighting isn't about size or strength. It's about will. It's about refusing to be a victim. Tobias leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. In the mountains, I've seen rabbits fight off foxes when cornered. I've seen small birds drive away hawks twice their size when protecting their nests. They fight because they have to, because the alternative is death. You fight with what you have, and what you have is more than you think. Clara took the pistol, surprised by its weight. It felt strange in her hands, foreign and dangerous, but also, in a way she couldn't quite explain, empowering. Why are you doing this? She asked. Helping me? You don't know me. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. 7 years ago, I had a younger brother, Daniel. He was 12, born with a twisted leg that made him walk with a limp. The boys in our town tormented him for it. Every day, new cruelty. I tried to protect him. I beat up the bullies, threatened anyone who looked at him wrong. The priest called me violent, said I was corrupting Daniel with anger. They threw me out of the church, said I was going to hell for fighting. He paused, jaw tightening. 2 years later, Daniel hanged himself in our father's barn, left a note that said, "You tried to protect me, but no one can protect me from myself. I'm too tired to keep living in a world that hates me." Clara's breath caught. I'm so sorry. I went to the mountains because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand to watch them destroy each other while calling it civilization. Tobias looked at her then, and she saw old grief in his eyes. But you remind me of Daniel. Not weak, never weak, but worn down by constant cruelty. The difference is you're still here, still fighting, even if you don't call it fighting. And I won't watch someone suffer the way Daniel did when I have the power to help. Not again. The weight of his confession settled between them. Clara understood then that this wasn't just kindness. This was Tobias trying to redeem something he felt he'd failed at long ago. And knowing that made his help no less valuable, only more precious. I'll learn, she said, gripping the pistol tighter. Teach me everything you can. Tobias nodded, and for the first time since Clara had met him, he smiled. It transformed his severe face, making him look younger, less burdened. We start tomorrow. First lesson is simple. A gun is just a tool, like a knife or a hammer. It's not good or evil. It's what you do with it that matters. You'll learn to use it to protect yourself, not to hurt others. There's a difference. As the last light faded from the sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. Clara held her new pistol, feeling its weight, imagining a future where she might not be helpless, where she might be able to stand up for herself. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel invisible. But neither of them knew that eyes were watching from a window in the officers' quarters. Eyes that saw Tobias Blackwell's kindness to the fat cook and registered it as a threat. Eyes that belonged to a man who would soon arrive at Silver Ridge with plans that would test Clara's newfound strength in ways neither she nor Tobias could imagine. The next morning arrived with a commotion that disrupted the fort's usual routine. 3 wagons rolled through the main gate, each pulled by 4 horses and covered with crimson canvas. They were merchant wagons, expensive and well-maintained, the kind that carried luxury goods from the east. From the lead wagon descended Augustus Pemberton, and he descended like royalty, gracing peasants with his presence. At 46 years old, he carried 280 pounds on a 5'9" frame. But unlike Clara's weight, his was displayed with pride beneath expensive black velvet vests and tailored wool trousers. Gold watch chains stretched across his considerable belly. 3 gold rings adorned his pudgy fingers. His hair was slicked back with expensive pomade, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points. The smell of Cuban cigars and French cologne preceded him. Behind Pemberton came his assistant, Silas Crane. Where Pemberton was round and jovial, Silas was gaunt and severe. His face looked like weathered parchment stretched over bone, his eyes narrow and cold as a snake's. White hair crowned his head despite him being only 38, and his fingers were long and spidery, constantly moving as if counting invisible coins. Captain Hayes emerged from his office to greet them, his military bearing stiff and formal. Mr. Pemberton, we received your letter. Welcome to Silver Ridge. Pemberton grasped Hayes' hand with both of his own, pumping it enthusiastically. Captain, wonderful to finally be here. The journey was dreadful. Simply dreadful, but I've heard such good things about your fort. So efficient, so well run, perfect for my needs. And you mentioned fur trading in your letter, Hayes said, extracting his hand from Pemberton's grip. Indeed, the Chicago Fur Trading Company has identified Montana Territory as a prime source for premium pelts. We intend to buy from the local trappers, store the furs here temporarily, then ship them east for sale. Very lucrative for everyone involved. Pemberton gestured grandly. And of course, we're prepared to compensate the fort generously for the use of your storage facilities. He reached into his vest and produced a leather pouch. The sound of coins clinking was unmistakable. Pemberton loosened the drawstring and poured a cascade of gold eagles into his palm. $500 for 3 months' use of your largest warehouse. And I'm sure we can find other ways to ensure the fort's cooperation in protecting our investment. Hayes's eyes fixed on the gold. $500 was more than the fort's operating budget for half a year. It could buy new weapons, fresh horses, winter supplies. It was a fortune. That's very generous, Mr. Pemberton. I believe in paying well for quality service, Captain, and I expect quality service in return. The trappers here can be rough characters. If there are any disputes, any accusations, I trust the fort's authorities will recognize who their true allies are. The implication was clear. Hayes hesitated only a moment before nodding. The fort protects the interests of all law-abiding citizens, Mr. Pemberton, especially those who contribute so significantly to our welfare. Excellent, Pemberton clapped his hands together. Sluss, arrange for our goods to be moved into the warehouse. And Captain, might I prevail upon your hospitality for rooms? Private rooms, mind you. I'm not accustomed to barracks life. Of course, we have quarters reserved for visiting dignitaries. As Hayes led Pemberton toward the officers' building, they passed through the yard where Clara was hanging laundry to dry. She had her back to them, arms raised to pin a sheet to the line. Pemberton stopped mid-stride and stared, then burst into loud laughter. Good Lord, Captain, do you keep livestock in the compound? I thought I saw a cow, but it's wearing a dress. Clara froze, her hands gripping the sheet. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders hunched, as if expecting a blow. Silas joined his employer's laughter. Not a cow, sir. That appears to be your cook, based on the direction she came from. The cook? Pemberton walked closer, circling Clara like a buyer examining livestock. Merciful heavens, I've seen grizzly bears with better figures. Tell me, my dear, do you ever leave food for the rest of us, or do you consume it all yourself? The soldiers within earshot laughed. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Clara kept her eyes down, willing herself to disappear, to become invisible again. She'd almost forgotten this feeling, almost started to believe Tobias when he said she was strong. But words like Pemberton's reminded her of the truth. She was just the fat cook, just the object of mockery. Nothing had really changed. Mr. Pemberton, Hayes said with forced lightness, Miss Whitmore is an adequate cook. She keeps the men fed. Miss Whitmore, Pemberton repeated, as if tasting something distasteful. Well, Miss Whitmore, do try to maintain some standards of appearance. This is a military installation, not a pig farm. He walked away, still chuckling. Silas followed, casting one more contemptuous glance at Clara before disappearing into the officers' quarters. Clara stood motionless, the laundry forgotten, feeling 3 years of hard-won progress crumble around her. One moment, one encounter with a man like Pemberton, and she was right back where she started. Invisible when she wanted to be seen, too visible when she wanted to disappear. She didn't notice Tobias standing in the shadow of the smithy 30 feet away. He'd witnessed the entire exchange, and his hands had curled into fists hard enough to make his knuckles white. But he waited, watching Clara, waiting to see what she would do. Clara took a shaking breath, then another. Then she picked up the next sheet and continued hanging laundry. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop working. Didn't run away. Didn't break down. Tobias unclenched his fists and walked away. She didn't need him to fight this battle. She was fighting it herself in the only way she knew how, by refusing to quit, by surviving. 2 days passed. Pemberton settled into his quarters and began receiving trappers who came to sell their furs. He paid fair prices, or so it seemed, weighing each pelt carefully on a brass scale he kept in the warehouse. Silas recorded every transaction in a large leather-bound ledger, his spidery handwriting filling page after page. But on the second night, Clara couldn't sleep. Her knees ached, a deep bone pain that kept her awake no matter how she positioned herself. Finally, at 2 in the morning, she gave up and went to the kitchen to brew tea from willow bark, which helped with the pain. The fort was silent at this hour, just wind and the occasional whinny from the stables. Clara moved through the darkness with practiced ease, needing no lamp to navigate the familiar paths. She was returning from the well with water when she heard voices. They came from Pemberton's warehouse. Quiet voices, but carrying in the still night air. Clara froze, instinct telling her to stay hidden. She pressed herself against the wall of the smithy, barely breathing. Already moved 40 pounds? That was Pemberton's voice, pitched low. Yes, sir. Silas, equally quiet, adjusted the ledger entry by entry. A pound here, 2 pounds there, across 10 different lots. No one will notice the discrepancy. Good. When we sell the full weight in Chicago, we'll pocket the difference. The trappers can't read anyway, and even if they could, they wouldn't dare challenge me. The extra profit will be substantial. $2,000 minimum. What about Blackwell? Silas asked. He seems sharp, keeps detailed records of his own sales. We'll handle him if necessary. Find a reason to accuse him of something. Hayes needs my money. He'll side with me. These mountain men are barely human anyway. No one will care if one disappears. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought they might hear it. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. Slowly, carefully, she backed away into deeper shadows. Inside the warehouse, Pemberton continued speaking, but Clara was already running, her painful knees forgotten, her only thought to get away before they discovered her. She made it back to her small room behind the kitchen and sat on her narrow cot, shaking. She'd heard everything. Pemberton was stealing from his own inventory and planning to frame someone, possibly Tobias. And he was conspiring with Captain Hayes, or at least confident Hayes would support him. What could she do? She was just the cook. If she told anyone what she'd heard, who would believe her? Pemberton was rich, influential, well-connected. She was Fat Clara, the object of jokes and contempt. But she knew the truth, and somehow she would have to find the courage to speak it. The next morning, Clara went through her routine mechanically, her mind churning. She jumped at every sound, terrified that Pemberton or Silas had somehow known she was there, that they would come for her. But the day passed normally. Pemberton held court in the officers' mess, charming Hayes and the senior soldiers with stories from Chicago high society. That evening, as promised, Tobias came to teach Clara to shoot. They walked a quarter-mile from the fort to a small clearing where the sound wouldn't disturb anyone. Tobias set up tin cans on fallen logs and showed Clara the basics. The gun is an extension of your arm, he explained, standing behind her and adjusting her grip. His hands were gentle but firm, positioning her fingers correctly on the handle. Don't fight it. Work with it. Aim not just with your eyes, but with your whole body. And most importantly, respect it. This tool can save your life or take one. That's a responsibility. Clara's first shot went wide, the recoil surprising her. The second missed as well, but the third shot clipped a can, sending it spinning. She lowered the gun and looked at Tobias, her eyes wide. I hit it. You did, Tobias confirmed, and the pride in his voice made Clara's chest swell. You're a natural, just needed someone to show you the way. They practiced until the light faded. By the end, Clara could hit 4 out of 10 cans. Not expert accuracy, but enough to defend herself if needed. As they walked back to the fort, Clara wrestled with whether to tell Tobias what she'd overheard. Finally, she couldn't hold it in. Tobias, there's something you need to know. Something about Pemberton. She told him everything, the conversation in the warehouse, the plan to adjust weights and pocket the difference, the casual mention of framing someone if necessary. Tobias listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. That's serious, he finally said. If you're right, Pemberton is stealing from every trapper who sells to him, including me. I sold him 15 pelts yesterday. I know what I heard, Clara insisted. I'm not lying. I believe you, Tobias said, and the simple certainty in his voice made Clara want to cry. But proving it will be hard. Men like Pemberton are careful, Burton. They don't make mistakes. There's a ledger, Clara said suddenly. Silas mentioned adjusting the ledger. There must be 2 sets of books, one for show and one with the real numbers. Tobias nodded slowly. That makes sense. And where would he keep the real one? His room, probably. Somewhere close, but hidden. Then we need to find it, Tobias said, before he has a chance to use whatever scheme he's planning. But before they could act, fate intervened. The next morning, Pemberton's voice rang out across the compound, loud and outraged. Thief! Someone has stolen from me! Captain Hayes, I demand justice! The entire fort rushed to the warehouse. Pemberton stood at the entrance, his face red with fury, gesturing wildly. Silas hovered behind him, playing the concerned assistant perfectly. 40 pounds of premium sea otter pelts, Gunin, vanished in the night. This is an outrage. Pemberton spun to face Captain Hayes. I trusted your security, Captain. I was assured my goods would be safe. Hayes, looking uncomfortable, tried to calm him. Mr. Pemberton, I assure you we'll investigate thoroughly. When did you discover the theft? This morning during inventory. The pelts were here yesterday. Someone broke in overnight and stole them. Pemberton's eyes swept across the gathered crowd, then stopped, fixed on one person. On Tobias Blackwell. Him, Pemberton said, pointing with a trembling finger. That mountain man. He was skulking around the warehouse last night. Silas saw him. All eyes turned to Tobias. He stood calm, arms crossed, expression neutral. I wasn't near the warehouse last night. I was outside the fort teaching Miss Whitmore to shoot. We didn't return until after dark. A convenient alibi, Pemberton sneered. The word of a fat cook who probably does whatever you say. Not very convincing, is it, Captain? Clara felt the words like physical blows. In one sentence, Pemberton had dismissed her testimony and reminded everyone of her status, of her worthlessness in their eyes. Hayes looked between Pemberton and Tobias. The calculation on his face was obvious. Pemberton had money and influence. Tobias was just another mountain man, here today and gone tomorrow. The choice wasn't hard. Blackwell, Hayes said heavily, I'm going to have to hold you until we sort this out. Sergeant Duncan, place Mr. Blackwell in custody. Duncan stepped forward with obvious pleasure, pulling iron shackles from his belt. Tobias didn't resist, but his eyes never left Pemberton's face. The merchant smiled back, a small, satisfied smile that said everything. As Duncan locked the shackles around Tobias's wrists, Clara stood paralyzed. She knew this was the plan Pemberton had mentioned. Frame someone, make an example. And Tobias, who had shown her kindness, who had taught her she wasn't invisible, was being sacrificed. Hayes cleared his throat. Mr. Pemberton has invoked his right as an injured party to witness punishment. The sentence for theft of this magnitude is 30 lashes, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. Pemberton himself will deliver the punishment, as is his right. 30 lashes, enough to scar a man permanently, enough to kill someone if the whip struck wrong. Clara watched Tobias being led away, and something inside her broke. Not broke like shattering, but broke like ice breaking in spring, like something frozen finally beginning to thaw and move. She knew the truth. She was the only one who knew. And Tobias had told her that strength wasn't about size. It was about will, about refusing to be a victim. For 3 years she'd been silent. 3 years of accepting abuse, of making herself invisible, of hoping that if she just endured, eventually things would get better. They hadn't. They never would, not unless she changed. Tobias had given her the tools, had taught her to see herself as strong, had shown her that sometimes survival meant fighting back. Now it was time to prove he'd been right about her. As the crowd dispersed and Pemberton returned to his quarters, Clara made a decision. Tomorrow at dawn, when they brought Tobias out for punishment, she would speak. She would tell everyone what she'd heard. She would face Pemberton and Hayes and every soldier who'd ever mocked her, and she would stand for the truth. She didn't know if anyone would believe her, didn't know if it would make any difference, but she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. Clara Whitmore was about to become visible, and the whole fort was about to see what real courage looked like. Dawn broke over Silver Ridge with a silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Clara hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting on her narrow cot, the pistol Tobias had given her resting in her lap, its weight somehow comforting. Her hands had stopped shaking around 3 a.m, replaced by a strange calm that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Terrifying, but also clarifying. From this height, you could see everything clearly. The fort bell rang at 5:30, calling the garrison to assemble. Clara rose, dressed in her cleanest dress, a plain brown wool that had seen better days but was at least free of stains. She braided her hair with steady fingers, pinned it up, and studied her reflection in the small cracked mirror that hung on her wall. The face that looked back was familiar, but somehow different. The same round cheeks, the same tired eyes. But something had changed behind those eyes. Something had woken up. She walked out into the compound as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and red. Soldiers were gathering in a loose circle around a wooden post that had been driven into the ground overnight. Tobias stood beside it, his hands bound behind his back, his shirt already removed to expose his weathered back. Scars crisscrossed his skin, old marks from a life lived hard in unforgiving places. Soon there would be fresh ones to add to the collection. Captain Hayes stood to one side, his face carefully neutral. Pemberton waited near the post, holding a braided leather whip that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood anatomy and how to cause maximum pain. The merchant's face glowed with anticipation barely disguised as righteous anger. This wasn't about justice for him. This was entertainment. Clara positioned herself at the back of the crowd, her heart hammering but her feet planted. Wait, she told herself. Wait for the right moment. Tobias had taught her about hunting, about how the difference between success and failure often came down to patience, to knowing when to move and when to be still. Hayes raised his hand for silence. The murmuring crowd quieted, and in that stillness, Clara could hear the wind moving through the pine trees beyond the fort walls, could hear a hawk crying somewhere in the distance. Life continuing, indifferent to human suffering. Tobias Blackwell, Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the compound. You stand accused of theft. 40 pounds of premium pelts valued at $800. The evidence against you is substantial. A witness places you near the warehouse. A piece of cloth from your coat was found inside. You have no alibi that can be verified by anyone of standing. Clara's jaw tightened at that last phrase. Anyone of standing, as if her word meant nothing. As if 3 years of faithful service, of keeping these men alive through her labor, counted for less than nothing because of how she looked. Do you have anything to say before sentence is carried out? Hayes continued. Tobias turned his head slightly, his gray eyes scanning the crowd until they found Clara. For a moment, their gazes locked. He didn't look afraid, didn't look defeated. He looked at her with something like pride, as if he knew what she was planning and approved. Then he looked back at Hayes. I'm innocent, Tobias said simply, but I know that doesn't matter here. Men like Pemberton buy the truth they want. So do what you're going to do. I'll survive it. I've survived worse. Pemberton laughed, a high, cruel sound. Such bravado. Let's see how brave you are after the first 10 lashes, mountain man. Let's see if you're still spouting noble words when your back is hamburger. He raised the whip, testing its weight with a few practice swings. The leather whistled through the air, and several soldiers winced at the sound. Even men accustomed to violence recognized cruelty when they saw it. Normally, Pemberton said loudly, clearly performing for the audience, I'd let the soldiers handle such unpleasant business. But when a man steals from me personally, I believe in delivering justice with my own hand. It's important that everyone understand what happens to those who cross me. He positioned himself, the whip trailing behind him in the dust, drew his arm back, muscles tensed. The whip began its forward arc, leather singing its vicious song toward Tobias's exposed back. Clara moved. She didn't remember deciding to move. Her body simply acted, propelled by something deeper than thought, more primal than reason. She crashed through the circle of soldiers, her weight and momentum carrying her forward like a boulder rolling downhill. Men stumbled aside, cursing in surprise. No! The word tore from her throat as she threw herself between Tobias and the descending whip. She felt the leather strike her back like a line of fire drawn by a burning blade. The impact drove her to her knees, and white-hot agony exploded across her shoulders. She heard fabric tear, felt warm blood begin to trickle down her spine. But she stayed upright, stayed between Tobias and Pemberton, her arms spread wide, her body a shield. The entire fort froze. 200 souls stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. The fat cook, the woman they'd mocked and tormented for 3 years, had just taken a whip meant for someone else. Pemberton stood with the whip raised, his face purple with rage. Get out of the way, you stupid cow! Clara forced herself to her feet. Her legs shook, threatening to give out, but she locked her knees and stayed standing. When she spoke, her voice came out stronger than she'd ever heard it, stronger than she knew she possessed. If you want to beat an innocent man, then you'll have to beat me first. Clara, no. Tobias's voice behind her was anguished. Don't do this, please. She didn't turn around, didn't take her eyes off Pemberton. You told me strength is about will, about refusing to be a victim. You were right. Captain Hayes found his voice. Whitmore, step aside. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me more than anyone, Clara said, and now she turned her head to look at Hayes, at the assembled soldiers, at every face that had sneered at her or looked through her for 3 years. Because I know something none of you know. I know who really stole those pelts. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pemberton's face went from purple to an unhealthy shade of gray. She's lying, a desperate woman trying to save her lover or some such nonsense. I'm not lying, Clara said, her voice rising, and I can prove it. Hayes stepped forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. Prove it how? Clara took a shaking breath. This was it. The moment where she either saved Tobias or destroyed herself, possibly both. But silence was no longer an option. Silence had never been safety. It had only been slow death. 3 nights ago, I couldn't sleep. My knees hurt, so I went to make tea. On my way back from the well, I passed Mr. Pemberton's warehouse. I heard voices. I stopped to listen. Every eye in the fort was on her now. Some skeptical, some curious, some, like young Jimmy Chen, leaning forward with something like hope on their faces. I heard Mr. Pemberton and Silas discussing how they'd moved 40 pounds of pelts to a different location, how they'd adjusted the ledger entries, a pound here, 2 pounds there, across multiple lots, how no one would notice the discrepancy. They were stealing from their own inventory so they could sell the full weight in Chicago, while the books here showed less. The difference would be pure profit. "Lies," Pemberton shouted, but there was panic in his voice now. "Captain, are you going to let this woman's fantasies delay justice?" But Hayes was looking at Clara with new attention. Years of command had taught him to read people, and something in Clara's face, some desperate honesty, gave him pause. "You heard this conversation? You're certain?" "Yes, sir, I was there. I heard every word." Clara pressed her advantage, even as blood continued to seep through her torn dress. They also discussed needing a scapegoat if anyone questioned the numbers. Mr. Pemberton said these mountain men were barely human anyway, that no one would care if one disappeared. The crowd erupted, angry voices, skeptical voices, all talking over each other. Hayes raised his hand for silence, and gradually the noise subsided. "These are serious accusations, Miss Whitmore. Do you have any evidence beyond what you claim to have heard?" This was the moment Clara had been preparing for. "Yes, sir. Mr. Pemberton uses the scale in the warehouse to weigh pelts. But there's another scale, a smaller brass one that Silas keeps in their private quarters. I've seen it when I deliver meals. That's the real scale, the one that shows true weight. The warehouse scale has been adjusted to read light." Pemberton laughed, but it sounded forced. "This is absurd. A scale is a scale." "And there's a ledger," Clara continued, speaking faster now, words tumbling out before courage could fail her. "A green leather book, about this big." She held her hands apart to show the size. "Silas keeps it under his mattress. It has the real numbers, the actual weights of everything you've received and sold. The true accounting." Hayes studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to his sergeant. "Duncan, take 2 men and search Mr. Pemberton's quarters in Silas's room. Look for the scale and the ledger Miss Whitmore described." "Sir!" Pemberton's composure cracked completely. "This is a violation of my privacy based on the ravings of a fat woman who probably wants to protect her illicit lover. You can't seriously be considering this." "I'm considering that Miss Whitmore has served this fort faithfully for 3 years," Hayes said coldly. "She's never caused trouble, never lied that I'm aware of. And right now, her story is more convincing than your outrage, Mr. Pemberton. Sergeant, go now." Duncan looked between Hayes and Pemberton, clearly torn, but military discipline won out. He gestured to 2 soldiers and headed toward the officers' quarters. The weight felt eternal. Clara remained standing, though her back screamed and her legs trembled. She could feel blood soaking into her dress, could feel the stares of everyone around her, but she'd come too far to collapse now. Tobias spoke softly behind her. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. Whatever happens now, know that." Before Clara could respond, Jimmy Chen pushed through the crowd to stand beside her. The young soldier's face was set with determination. "I believe her," Jimmy announced loudly. "Miss Whitmore has never lied about anything. 3 years ago, when I had dysentery, too sick and ashamed to go to the infirmary, she brought me clean water and food, sat with me when I was too weak to stand, never told anyone, never asked for anything in return. She helped half the men here when we were sick or hurt. We repaid her with insults and cruelty." He looked around at the other soldiers. "If she says Pemberton's a thief, then he's a thief. Her word is worth more than his gold." Another soldier stepped forward, then another. Within moments, a dozen men had moved to stand near Clara, not quite beside her, but close enough to show support. Men she'd helped secretly over the years, acts of kindness she'd performed thinking no one noticed or cared. They had noticed. They had cared. They'd just been too cowardly to acknowledge it until someone else was brave first. Pemberton saw his support crumbling and played his last card. $500 to any man who'll testify that this woman is lying. $1,000 if you can prove she's Blackwell's accomplice in the original theft. Silence. Not one soldier moved. The offer hung in the air, tempting but somehow too dirty to touch now. Clara had changed something fundamental in the fort's atmosphere, had reminded these men that some things mattered more than money. The sound of boots on wood announced Duncan's return. He carried a small brass scale in one hand and a green leather ledger in the other. His expression was grim. Found them exactly where she said they'd be, Sir, Duncan reported, handing both items to Hayes. The scale reads 3 pounds heavier than the warehouse scale for the same test weight. And the ledger, he paused. The ledger shows systematic discrepancies going back 6 months. Hayes opened the book, scanning the neat columns of numbers. His face darkened with each line he read. When he finally looked up, his gaze could have melted iron. 45 pounds of sea otter at actual weight, logged as 38 pounds. 52 pounds of beaver pelts at actual weight, logged as 46. It goes on, page after page. He snapped the book shut. Mr. Pemberton, it appears the only thief at Silver Ridge is you. The compound erupted. Soldiers who had been ready to watch Tobias whipped now turned their anger on Pemberton. The merchant tried to back away, but found himself surrounded by hostile faces. This is a misunderstanding. Pemberton's voice climbed toward hysteria. That ledger belongs to Silas. I knew nothing about it. He must have been skimming behind my back. Then where is Silas? Hayes demanded. Where's your assistant? A corporal pushed forward. Sir, Silas's horse is missing from the stable. Looks like he fled sometime last night. Probably heard that Miss Whitmore had been asking questions. How convenient, Hayes said with ice in his voice. Your accomplice has fled, leaving you to face the consequences alone. Sergeant Duncan, release Mr. Blackwell immediately. Mr. Pemberton, you are under arrest for fraud, theft, and filing false accusations. As soldiers moved to free Tobias and seize Pemberton, Clara felt her legs finally give out. She sank to her knees, the adrenaline that had kept her upright draining away all at once. The world tilted dangerously, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Tobias, his hands finally free of bonds, lowered her gently to the dirt. His sun-darkened features was very close to hers, and his gray eyes shone with unshed tears. Why, he whispered. Clara, why would you do that? You could have been killed. She managed a weak smile through the pain. Because someone had to. Because you taught me that in the mountains, you survive by watching out for each other. I figured the same should be true down here. You stepped in front of a whip for me. And you stood up to Duncan for me. I'd say we're even. Tobias shook his head slowly, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her, not just recognizing, but understanding. We'll never be even. What you just did. Clara, I've known grizzly hunters and Indian fighters, men who faced down death without flinching. But you're braver than all of them. I'm not brave, Clara protested. I was terrified. I'm still terrified. That, Tobias said softly, is exactly what brave means. Doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Anyone can be fearless. Only the strong can be brave. Your Edward Finch pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. The fort's physician was 58, with white hair and steel-rimmed spectacles that made him look like a stern schoolmaster. But his hands were gentle as he examined the whip mark across Clara's back. You'll have a scar, he told her, carefully cleaning the wound with alcohol that burned worse than the original strike. But you'll heal. Though I have to say, Miss Whitmore, that was the most foolhardy, courageous thing I've witnessed in 20 years of military service. Will I be punished? Clara asked quietly. For interfering? Finch snorted. Punished? Girl, Captain Hayes would look like a monster if he punished you now. You exposed a thief and saved an innocent man. If anything, you'll probably never have to pay for a drink in the fort's tavern again. He paused in his work. Not that you drink, but you take my meaning. He was more right than Clara could have imagined. As word of what happened spread through Silver Ridge, The attitude toward her underwent a seismic shift. Soldiers who had mocked her for years now approached with respectful nods. Some couldn't meet her eyes, shame written clearly on their faces. Others offered awkward thanks for kindnesses she'd shown them that they'd never acknowledged before. Private Jimmy Chen organized a collection among the garrison. Nearly every man contributed coins, enough to buy Clara a new dress to replace the one destroyed by the whip. When Jimmy presented her with the money, his eyes were wet. "We've been blind," he said. "We saw you every day but never really looked at you. Never saw who you really were. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore." "We're all sorry." Clara accepted the apology with grace she didn't entirely feel. Part of her wanted to rage at them, to demand why it took her nearly dying before they saw her as human. But another part, the part Tobias had helped her find, understood that people change slowly, that sometimes you had to give them permission to be better than they'd been. "Thank you, Jimmy," she said simply. "And please, call me Clara." But the most significant change came from Tobias himself. That evening, after Clara had been treated and the fort had slowly returned to its routine, he found her sitting outside the kitchen watching the sunset. He carried a rolled bundle under his arm. "Clara," he said, sitting down beside her on the wooden bench, "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she said, and was rewarded with one of his rare smiles. "I owe you my life. Saying thank you doesn't begin to cover that debt. So I want to do something more, something meaningful." He paused, gathering his words. "You live in that tiny room behind the kitchen. No windows, barely enough space to turn around. You deserve better than that." "It's adequate," Clara said, though they both knew it wasn't. "I want to build you a house," Tobias continued. "A real house, small but solid. A cabin like the ones I build in the mountains. One room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, good thick walls that'll keep you warm in winter. I'll put it about 200 yards from the fort, near that little stream, close enough for safety, far enough for privacy." Clara stared at him. "Tobias, you can't. That's too much. Building a house takes weeks, and you need to get back to your mountains before the heavy snows come." "I'll stay through winter," he said simply. "First time in 7 years. But I'll stay. Build your house right. Make sure it's solid before the cold really sets in. I can trap locally, enough to get by. The mountains will still be there come spring." "But why?" Clara asked, her voice cracking. "Why would you do this for me?" Tobias was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. 7 years ago, I failed someone who needed me. My brother Daniel. I tried to protect him, but I did it wrong. I fought his battles instead of teaching him to fight his own. When I wasn't there, he had no defenses. He gave up." He turned to look at Clara, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. "But you're different, and you didn't give up. You learned to fight your own battles. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. You reminded me that protecting someone isn't about fighting for them, and it's about giving them a safe place to grow strong." "A house," Clara whispered. "A house. A place that's yours, where no one can make you feel small or worthless, where you can breathe." He smiled slightly. "Everyone deserves a place where they can breathe, Clara, especially someone who's spent 3 years suffocating." Tears slid down Clara's cheeks. Not tears of pain or humiliation, but something else entirely. Something that felt like hope taking solid form. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes. Say you'll let me do this." "Yes," Clara said. "Yes, please. Thank you." Tobias nodded, satisfied. "Good. I'll start tomorrow. And Clara, this isn't charity. It's not pity. It's respect. You've earned this 100 times over." The next morning, Tobias began selecting the site for Clara's cabin. He walked the area near the small stream that ran past the fort, testing the ground, checking sight lines, examining the trees. Clara watched from a distance, not wanting to interfere but unable to stay away. This was going to be her house, her home, the first place in her adult life that would be truly hers. By midday, Tobias had marked out the foundation with stakes and string. By afternoon, word had spread through the fort, and Jimmy Chen appeared with a group of soldiers. "We want to help," Jimmy announced. "If Miss Clara is getting a house, we're going to help build it. Only right, considering how much we owe her." Tobias looked at Clara, one eyebrow raised in question. She nodded, overwhelmed. "Thank you, all of you." What followed was a month of the hardest and most rewarding work Clara had ever experienced. Every evening after her kitchen duties were complete, she would walk to the building site and watch the cabin take shape. The soldiers worked in shifts, some cutting trees and hauling logs, others notching and fitting the timber. Tobias oversaw everything with the exacting standards of someone who knew that sloppy work could mean death in the mountains. But he also made sure Clara was involved. He taught her to mix the clay and moss that would seal the gaps between logs, showed her how to select stones for the fireplace, explaining which types would hold heat best and which might crack under stress. Included her in every decision about window placement, door size, the angle of the roof. "It's your house," he said when she questioned whether she should have so much input. "You should know how it's built. That way, if something breaks, you can fix it yourself. Independence isn't just having your own place. It's knowing how to maintain it." Dr. Finch contributed a window frame he'd been saving, beautiful glass panes that would let in morning light. Martha Henderson, the fort's seamstress, promised to make curtains and a warm quilt. Even Captain Hayes, perhaps feeling guilty about how close he'd come to making a terrible mistake, donated lumber from the fort's stores. But the most meaningful contributions came from the soldiers themselves. They worked with a dedication that went beyond obligation. Men who had mocked Clara, who had made her life miserable, now poured their energy into giving her something beautiful. It was as if building this cabin was their penance, their way of trying to make amends for 3 years of cruelty. And slowly watching them work, Clara found forgiveness. Not because what they'd done was acceptable, but because holding on to anger would only poison the new life she was building. They were trying to be better. That had to be enough. 4 weeks after construction began, the cabin stood complete. It was small, just one room with a sleeping loft reached by a ladder, but it was perfect. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, built so well it would hold heat for hours after the fire died. The door was solid oak with a heavy bolt lock. Windows faced east and south, positioned to catch maximum light. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow, covered with overlapping wooden shingles that Tobias had split by hand. Inside, the soldiers had built simple furniture: a sturdy table and chair, shelves along one wall, hooks for hanging clothes and tools, a rope bed frame that Martha Henderson had already fitted with a mattress stuffed with clean straw and covered with the promised quilt. But the detail that made Clara break down and cry was the small mirror hanging near the east window, positioned to catch the morning light. Tobias had placed it there himself while she was working in the fort kitchen. "So you can see yourself," he explained when he showed her the finished cabin. "Really see yourself, the way I see you, the way everyone at the fort sees you now, as someone who stood up when it mattered, someone who has more courage than any of us." Clara stood in the center of her new home, turning slowly to take it all in. Her home, her house, a place where she could be herself without apology, without fear, without having to make herself small. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't have better words than that, but thank you." "It's enough," Tobias said. He moved toward the door, then paused. "Clara, there's one more thing. The cabin has room for an addition. Not now, but eventually. An extra room could be added to the north side pretty easily." "An addition? Why would I need more room?" Tobias didn't quite meet her eyes. "I was thinking, when I come back from the mountains in spring, maybe I could build that room. For me. So I'd have a place to stay when I'm here at the fort, if you wanted. Only if you wanted." Clara's heart stuttered. "You want to live here with me?" "Not with you exactly. Near you, my own space, but connected. I'd still go to the mountains for hunting season, but I'd come back, have a place to return to." He finally looked at her. "I'd like to have a place that feels like home. And this place, with you in it, that feels like home to me." It wasn't a declaration of love. Tobias wasn't the type for flowery speeches. But somehow it was more meaningful than poetry. This was a man who had lived alone for 7 years, who had chosen solitude over society, saying that he wanted to be near her, that her presence made a place worth returning to. "Yes," Clara said. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Tobias smiled, and the warmth in that expression transformed his severe face. "Then when I come back in March, we'll start on the addition. Make this a real home." The days grew shorter as autumn deepened toward winter. Tobias prepared for his journey into the mountains, checking his gear, stocking up on ammunition and supplies. Clara moved into her cabin and marveled at the simple luxury of having her own space, of being able to close a door and know she was safe, of waking to sunlight through her own windows. She also discovered something unexpected. Without the constant stress of fort life, of being always on display and always mocked, her body began to feel different. Not smaller necessarily, but stronger. She split her own firewood, hauled her own water from the stream. Her arms grew harder, her legs more steady. The weight didn't leave her body, it never would, but it redistributed itself. Muscle replaced softness. Her 260 pounds became 240 pounds of someone who could chop wood for an hour without stopping. She still carried her weight, but it distributed differently, became muscle as much as fat. And when she looked in the mirror Tobias had hung, she saw someone she barely recognized. Someone with clear eyes and straight shoulders. Someone who looked like she could handle whatever life threw at her. On the evening before Tobias was to leave, they sat together on the bench outside Clara's cabin and watched the first snow of the season begin to fall. Fat flakes drifted down in the still air, catching the last light of sunset and glowing like tiny flames. "You'll be careful?" Clara asked. "Always am. Mountain won't kill me. I'm too stubborn." Tobias was quiet for a moment. "But I'll miss this. Miss you. That's new for me. Usually I can't wait to get back to the high country. This time, part of me wants to stay." "Then why go?" "Because that's who I am. I'm a mountain man. It's in my blood, in my bones. I need that solitude, that struggle against nature. But now I also need this. Need you. It's like being split in two, pulled in different directions." Clara understood. She'd spent 3 years wishing she could disappear, could escape the fort and everyone in it. But now she had ties here, people who respected her, a home she loved, Tobias who saw her as she truly was. "The mountains will still be there," she said, "and so will I. Go do what you need to do. I'll be here when you come back." Tobias reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he'd initiated such contact, and Clara's breath caught. His hand was huge around hers, rough and scarred, but warm. "I'll think about you every day," he said, "and when I come back, we'll start on that addition. Make a home big enough for both of us, if that's still what you want come spring." "It will be," Clara said with certainty. They sat in silence as the snow fell heavier, covering the compound in white. In the morning, Tobias would leave for 3 months of solitary hunting in the high country, and Clara would begin the next chapter of her life, living independently for the first time ever, building a future she could barely imagine but desperately wanted. She was no longer invisible. She would never be invisible again. And that changed everything. Winter descended on Silver Ridge with the weight of a white blanket that muffled sound and softened edges. Clara woke each morning in her cabin to frost paintings on the windows and the profound silence that only deep snow can bring. The first week alone had been strange, almost unsettling. After 3 years of constant noise and scrutiny, the solitude felt like learning to breathe underwater. But gradually she adapted. More than adapted, she thrived. Every morning she rose before dawn and built up the fire that Tobias had taught her to bank properly overnight. She dressed in layers against the cold, then stepped outside to assess her small kingdom. The stream still ran, its water too fast to freeze completely, and she would break the ice that formed along the edges to fill her buckets. Her arms, once soft and unused to labor beyond kitchen work, had grown strong from this daily routine. The water was heavy, but she could carry it now without her knees screaming in protest. The fort remained part of her life, but on her own terms now. Captain Hayes had offered her a raise and better quarters inside the compound, but Clara had politely refused. She would still cook for the garrison, she said, but she would live in her own home. Come to the fort each day by choice, not necessity. Leave each evening to return to a place that was hers alone. Hayes had agreed, perhaps understanding that some freedoms, once tasted, could never be surrendered. The soldiers treated her differently now, not just with respect, though there was that, but with something closer to awe. The story of how she'd taken the whip meant for Tobias had grown in the telling, as stories do. Some versions had her standing unmoved through 3 lashes. Others claimed she'd wrestled the whip from Pemberton's hands. The truth was dramatic enough, but legends need embellishment to survive. Jimmy Chen, promoted to corporal now, had become something of a guardian to her. He organized a rotation among the younger soldiers to keep Clara's woodpile stocked and her path to the fort clear of snow. When she protested that she could manage on her own, Jimmy had looked at her with such earnest determination that she'd relented. "Please, Miss Clara," he'd said, "let us do this. Let us be better than we were." So she let them. Not because she needed the help, though it was welcome, but because she understood that sometimes people need to make amends not for the person they have wronged, but for themselves. Forgiveness given was a gift, but forgiveness accepted and acted upon was transformation. 6 weeks into Tobias's absence, Clara discovered something that changed everything. She'd been feeling tired, more than the winter and work could explain. Her stomach, always substantial, seemed firmer somehow, and her monthly courses, never regular but consistent enough, had stopped. Martha Henderson, the fort's seamstress, who had become something of a friend, noticed Clara's hand resting on her belly one afternoon and smiled knowingly. "How far along are you, dear?" Martha asked gently. Clara had stared at her, uncomprehending at first. Then understanding crashed over her like cold water. "I can't be. We never, Tobias and I, we didn't." But even as she said it, she remembered. The night before Tobias left for the mountains. They'd sat together in her cabin, talking until late about everything and nothing. And somewhere in those quiet hours, words had become touches. Touches had become kisses. And kisses had become something more. Something tender and careful and achingly sweet. Something she'd almost convinced herself hadn't happened. A dream too precious to examine in daylight. "Oh," Clara whispered. "Oh no." Martha's expression turned concerned. "Is the child unwanted?" "No, not unwanted. Never unwanted. But Tobias doesn't know. He's gone for another 6 weeks at least. And I don't know how he'll feel about this. We never discussed. We're not married. What will people say?" Martha laughed, a warm sound full of genuine affection. "Clara, dear girl, you stood in front of a whip. You exposed a thief and saved an innocent man. You've earned the right to live your life however you choose. Anyone who has something to say about it can answer to me. And trust me, they won't enjoy that conversation." Dr. Finch confirmed what Clara already knew in her heart. She was pregnant, about 2 months along, healthy despite her anxiety. The baby would come in July, just as the mountain meadows burst into full bloom. "Does Tobias know?" Finch asked, his wind-carved visage kind behind his spectacles. "He's in the mountains. Won't be back until March." "And how do you feel about that?" Clara considered the question seriously. How did she feel? Terrified, certainly. Uncertain about how Tobias would react. Worried about managing alone. But underneath all that fear ran a current of something else. Something that felt like joy. "I feel like my life is finally beginning," she said quietly. "For 24 years, I felt invisible. Then Tobias showed me I wasn't. And now there's going to be another person in the world who will see me every day. Love me not, despite how I look, but without even questioning it. A child doesn't judge. They just love." Finch smiled. "That's a good answer. And for what it's worth, I think Tobias will surprise you. He's a good man. Rough edges and all, but good straight through." Clara hoped he was right. The winter deepened. Clara's belly began to show. And with it came a strange shift in how people looked at her. Some of the older women in the fort, soldiers' wives who had largely ignored her before, now sought her out with advice and offers of help. They brought baby clothes they'd saved, knitted blankets, shared wisdom about pregnancy and childbirth with the casual authority of experience. Clara accepted it all with gratitude tinged with irony. Where had these women been when she was being mocked and tormented? But she pushed the bitter thoughts away. People changed. She had changed. The world kept turning, and holding grudges only weighed you down. She also discovered an unexpected talent. Dr. Finch, impressed by how she'd treated Tobias's infected foot months ago, began teaching her basic medicine in earnest. He was getting old, he said, and the fort needed someone who understood herbs and poultices and how to stitch a wound properly. Claire absorbed the knowledge like dry earth soaking up rain. She had a natural aptitude for diagnosis, an intuitive understanding of how the body worked and what it needed to heal. You could be a real doctor, Finch said one afternoon as Clara successfully set a soldier's broken finger. If you were a man or if the world were different, you could go to medical school. You're that good. The world isn't different, Clara replied, but she couldn't help the pride that swelled in her chest. But I can help people here. That's enough. Still, she began to imagine a future. Not just surviving day to day, but building something lasting. Maybe she could open a small clinic, treat the illnesses and injuries that soldiers were too proud to take to the fort infirmary, teach other women the skills Finch was teaching her, create something that would outlive her. Legacy, the word kept appearing in her thoughts. She was going to have a child, a legacy of blood and bone, but maybe she could have another kind of legacy too. One built of knowledge and healing and the simple act of seeing people who felt invisible. March arrived with false promises of spring. The snow began to melt, creating rivers of mud and slush that made walking treacherous. Clara was 5 months pregnant now, her belly round and firm beneath her dresses. Martha had altered her clothes to accommodate the growth, adding panels of fabric with a skill that made the modifications nearly invisible. Clara stood outside her cabin one morning, watching the sunrise paint the remaining snow gold in pink, when she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels, distant but growing closer. Her heart stuttered, then raced. She knew that rhythm, had memorized it from the first day Tobias arrived at Silver Ridge. He emerged from the tree line like something from a dream. Bigger than memory, more solid than fantasy. His beard had grown wild over the winter, his hair hung in tangles past his shoulders, and his clothes were stiff with old blood and the residue of hard living. 2 pack horses followed his wagon, both loaded with the winter's hunt. Hundreds of pounds of furs that represented months of solitary labor in the high country. But it was his eyes that held Clara frozen. Those gray eyes that had seen through her from the first moment, that had looked past the fat and mockery to find the person underneath. They found her now, standing in front of her cabin with her hands unconsciously cradling her swollen belly. Tobias stopped the wagon. For a long moment, he simply stared. Clara watched understanding dawn on his face, watched shock give way to something else, something she couldn't quite read. He climbed down from the wagon slowly, as if approaching a spooked animal, walked toward her with measured steps, stopped 5 feet away, close enough to see every detail of her changed body, far enough to give her space if she needed it. Clara, he said, his voice rough from months of disuse. In the mountains, he had no one to talk to. You're pregnant, she finished when he couldn't. About 5 months. The baby will come in July. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his eyes. I understand if you want to leave. If this isn't what you wanted, I won't hold you to anything. But you should know I'm keeping this child, our child, and I'll raise it with or without you. The speech she'd practiced for weeks came out more defiant than she'd intended, armor against the rejection she feared. But Tobias just stood there, his time-worn countenance working through emotions like clouds racing across the sky. Then, to her complete shock, he fell to his knees in the mud. May I? He asked, gesturing toward her belly. Clara nodded, unable to speak. Tobias reached out with hands that could break bones and kill bears, and placed them gently on the curve of her stomach. He held them there, reverent and still, as if waiting for something. The baby kicked. Clara felt it at the same moment Tobias did. A solid thump against his palm, the first kick strong enough to be felt from outside. Tobias's breath caught, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were bright with tears. A child, he whispered. We made a child. Are you angry? Clara asked, her voice small despite her earlier bravado. Angry? Tobias shook his head slowly. Clara, I'm terrified. I'm overwhelmed. I'm a mountain man who lives alone and talks to trees. I don't know the first thing about being a father. But angry? Never. He paused, searching for words. This is a gift I never thought I'd receive. A second chance I don't deserve. A second chance? Tobias stood but kept one hand on her belly as if afraid to lose contact with the life growing there. My brother Daniel, I failed him. But this child, our child, I won't fail them. I'll teach them everything I know. How to be strong, how to be kind, how to stand up for what's right, how to see people for who they really are, not what they look like. He cupped Clara's face with his free hand, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. And I'll teach them that their mother is the bravest person I've ever known, that she stood in front of a whip for a stranger, that she changed an entire fort with one act of courage, that she's beautiful and strong and worthy of every good thing this world can offer. I'm not beautiful, Clara protested weakly. You are to me, Tobias said simply. Always have been, always will be. The world's too blind to see it, but I'm not. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, mindful of the life between them. It was a promise, that kiss, a commitment more binding than any words. When they finally pulled apart, Tobias smiled. I guess we should talk about that addition now. Going to need it sooner than I thought. Baby needs a room. Clara laughed, the sound bright and free. Baby can sleep with me for the first year. We have time. Then I'll make it a bigger addition. 2 rooms, one for the baby eventually, one for me now. And Clara? He grew serious. I want to marry you. Proper ceremony, the whole thing. Not because of the baby, because I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours, if you'll have me. It wasn't the most romantic proposal ever spoken, but it was honest and true and perfectly Tobias. Clara thought her heart might burst. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. They were wed 3 weeks later in a ceremony that was simple but deeply felt. Captain Hayes officiated, the fort chaplain having recently departed for a new posting. Clara wore a dress Martha had made specially, cream-colored wool, with delicate embroidery along the hem and sleeves. Tobias had trimmed his beard and braided his hair, wearing clean buckskin that made him look like some ancient warrior prince. The entire fort attended. Soldiers stood in ranks, dress uniforms brushed clean for once. The officers' wives dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Jimmy Chen served as Tobias's witness, standing straight and proud in his corporal's uniform. Martha stood with Clara, beaming like the mother Clara had lost years ago. The vows were traditional, but when Tobias spoke the words, to have and to hold, from this day forward, his voice broke with emotion. And when Clara promised to love and honor him, she meant every syllable with an intensity that surprised even her. They sealed the marriage with a kiss that drew cheers and applause from the assembled witnesses. As they turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, Clara caught sight of her reflection in a window. She saw a woman in a beautiful dress, pregnant and glowing, standing beside a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. She barely recognized herself. But more than that, she recognized the feeling blooming in her chest. It was belonging. After 24 years of feeling like she existed on the margins of the world, she finally belonged somewhere, to someone, and someone belonged to her. The reception was held in the fort's mess hall, which had been decorated with pine boughs and wildflowers. Someone produced a fiddle and music filled the space. Soldiers danced with their wives and sweethearts. Jimmy Chen, emboldened by whiskey, asked Clara for a dance, and she accepted despite her pregnant belly, making graceful movement impossible. Thank you, Miss Clara, Jimmy said as they swayed awkwardly to the music, for showing us what courage looks like, for being patient with us when we didn't deserve it, for giving us a chance to be better. You did that yourselves, Clara replied. I just gave you permission. No, Jimmy insisted. You showed us it was possible, that people can change, that cruelty isn't inevitable. We just had to see someone be brave first. The words stayed with Clara long after the dance ended. She'd never thought of herself as brave. Even now, with everyone celebrating her courage, part of her still felt like that frightened woman kneeling in the mud, cleaning up spilled food while soldiers laughed. But maybe bravery wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was about acting despite the fear, about standing up even when your knees shook and your voice wavered. As spring deepened into early summer, Tobias worked on the cabin addition with the same careful craftsmanship he'd brought to the original structure. But this time Clara worked beside him. She couldn't lift heavy logs or work high on the roof, not with her belly growing larger every day. But she mixed mortar and handed tools and offered suggestions that Tobias always considered seriously. The addition took shape over 6 weeks. 2 rooms, as promised. One for Tobias, with a bed large enough for his frame and shelves for his traps and hunting gear. One for the baby, smaller but positioned to catch morning light and stay warm in winter. Between them, a door that could be closed for privacy or left open to create one larger space. Dr. Finch visited often during the construction, ostensibly to check on Clara's health, but really to escape the loneliness of his own quarters. He'd become something of a grandfather figure to her, and Clara treasured his gruff affection. You know, Finch said one afternoon as they sat watching Tobias fit the final window into the baby's room, I've been thinking about the future. I'm not getting any younger. My hands shake more each year. Soon I won't be able to stitch wounds or set bones properly. You're not that old, Clara protested. Old enough to know when it's time to plan succession. I want to train you properly, Clara. Not just herbs and basic care, but real medicine, surgery, diagnosis, the works. You have the aptitude and the dedication. The fort needs a healer, and you could be that person. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. I'm not educated. I can barely read medical texts. So we'll work on that too. I'll teach you to read better, to understand Latin terms, to think like a physician. It'll take years, but we have time. And when I'm too old or too dead to continue, you'll take over. The fort will have a healer who actually cares about the patients, not just about collecting pay. It was an opportunity Clara had never imagined, a future beyond cooking and cleaning, a purpose that mattered. I'd be honored, she said quietly. Thank you for believing in me. You saved a man's life by standing in front of a whip, Finch replied. I'm not taking a chance on you, Clara. I'm making the safest bet of my career. The baby came on a sweltering July afternoon when the heat made even breathing feel like work. Clara had been feeling strange all day, a tightness in her belly that ebbed and flowed like tides. By evening, she knew. The child was coming. Martha and Dr. Finch attended the birth. Tobias paced outside like a caged wolf, too anxious to sit but forbidden from entering by Martha's strict orders. The labor was long and difficult. Clara's size made the delivery complicated, and there were moments when Finch's face grew tight with concern. But Clara bore the pain with the same determination she'd shown standing in front of Pemberton's whip. She'd come too far to give up now. At 3 a.m, as a summer storm broke over the mountains and rain hammered the cabin roof, Clara's daughter entered the world with a furious wail that declared her very much alive and determined to be heard. A girl, Finch announced, placing the squalling infant on Clara's chest. Healthy lungs, all her fingers and toes, perfect. Clara looked down at the tiny red-faced creature in her arms and felt her heart crack open in ways she hadn't known were possible. This was her daughter, her child, a person who would grow up knowing she was loved and wanted and valued, who would never feel invisible because Clara would see her every day. Ada, Clara whispered, touching one impossibly small hand with her finger. The baby's fist closed around it with surprising strength. Her name is Ada. Martha stepped outside to tell Tobias, and moments later he burst through the door, still dripping rain. He approached the bed slowly, his huge frame making the cabin feel smaller, his weathered face transformed by wonder. May I? He asked, reaching for the baby. Clara placed Ada in her father's arms, and something magical happened. The tiny infant, who had been crying steadily since birth, quieted immediately. She looked up at Tobias with dark eyes that would eventually turn the same gray as his, and Tobias looked back like he was seeing heaven. Hello, little one, he rumbled in that deep voice. I'm your father, and I promise you'll never doubt that you're wanted, that you're loved, that you matter. His voice broke. I promise you'll never feel alone or unseen. I promise. He looked at Clara then, tears streaming unashamedly down his bearded face. Thank you for this gift, for giving me a family when I thought I'd lost the right to one. We're in this together, Clara said softly. You, me, and Ada. A family. The word hung in the air, precious and new. Family. Clara had been alone for so long, she'd forgotten what family meant. But here it was, contained in this small cabin on the edge of the wilderness, imperfect and strange, and more valuable than all the gold in California. The weeks after Ada's birth blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Clara had worried she wouldn't know how to be a mother, that her own childhood, lonely and marked by loss, hadn't equipped her for the task. But motherhood, she discovered, was mostly about showing up, being present, responding to needs. Love made the rest possible. Tobias was a revelation as a father. He took to the role with surprising ease, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Ada during her fussy evenings, singing old mountain songs in his rumbling baritone that always soothed her. He fashioned a cradle from carved pine and suspended it with rope so it would rock gently at the slightest touch. In the mountains, he explained to Clara, you learn to be self-sufficient, to do whatever needs doing without complaining. That includes taking care of children. My father helped raise me and Daniel, taught me that being a man meant taking responsibility, not avoiding it. The fort community embraced Ada's arrival with enthusiasm that surprised Clara. Soldiers who had once mocked her now stopped away with small gifts: a carved wooden rattle, a soft rabbit skin blanket, baby clothes sewn from scraps of fabric. Each gift came with awkward congratulations and shy smiles, as if these rough men weren't quite sure how to express their feelings, but were determined to try. Jimmy Chen was perhaps the most devoted. He visited nearly every day, always with some excuse, but clearly just wanting to see the baby. He would hold Ada with the careful reverence of someone holding something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. My mother had 7 children, he told Clara one afternoon. Oh, wow. I was the youngest. I remember how hard she worked, how tired she always was, but also how happy, how proud. You remind me of her, strong enough to carry the weight, but soft enough to still feel joy. Clara thought about that often in the months that followed. Strong enough to carry the weight, but soft enough to still feel joy. It felt like the balance she'd been seeking her whole life, not choosing between strength and vulnerability, but embodying both, being tough enough to survive and tender enough to thrive. As Ada grew from newborn to infant, Clara resumed her work with Dr. Finch. She couldn't manage the fort kitchen anymore, not with a baby to care for, but she could learn medicine. Finch came to the cabin 3 times a week, bringing books and supplies, teaching her everything from basic anatomy to complex surgical procedures on cadavers donated by soldiers who died from natural causes. It was gruesome work sometimes, but Clara had a strong stomach and a stronger determination. She absorbed information like a sponge, filling notebooks with observations and diagrams, practicing stitches on scraps of leather until her fingers could work by muscle memory alone. You're better than most doctors I trained with, Finch admitted after she successfully diagnosed a complicated case of appendicitis in a young soldier and recommended immediate surgery. You have intuition that can't be taught. You see patterns others miss. Clara began treating minor injuries and illnesses from her cabin, word spreading that Tobias Blackwell's wife was as good as the fort doctor and a lot more understanding. Soldiers came to her with ailments they were too embarrassed to take to Finch. Women from the surrounding area sought her out for female complaints that male doctors often dismissed. Clara treated everyone with the same careful respect, never judging, always listening. She charged those who could afford it and treated the poor for free, just as Finch had taught her. Medicine isn't about profit, he'd said. It's about healing, about seeing suffering and trying to ease it. The money's nice, but it's not the point. 3 years passed in what felt like a heartbeat. Ada grew into a sturdy toddler with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination. She was fearless in the way of children who've never been given reason to doubt themselves, climbing everything, exploring everywhere, asking endless questions that Tobias answered with patient seriousness. Why is the sky blue, Papa? Because it reflects the color of the oceans, little one. Why are oceans blue? Because water looks blue when there's enough of it. Wait, Ma, that's a good question. Let's look it up together. And they would spend hours poring over Finch's encyclopedias, father and daughter united in curiosity. Clara would watch them, her heart so full it ached. This was the family she dreamed of without knowing it was possible. Not perfect, but real. Solid. Hers. Clara's healing practice continued to grow. By 1876, she was treating more patients than Finch, and her reputation had spread beyond Silver Ridge to the surrounding settlements. People traveled days to see her, trusting her skill and her compassion equally. Dr. Finch, now in his 70s and plagued by arthritis that made fine work impossible, officially retired and named Clara his successor. There was grumbling from some of the older officers who thought a woman couldn't be a real doctor, But Captain Hayes, remembering the woman who'd stood in front of a whip, overruled them on them. Mrs. Blackwell has earned her place 100 times over, he declared. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. No one did. But Clara's greatest impact came not from her medical skill, but from her willingness to see people others overlooked. When a new family of immigrants arrived at the fort, she noticed the mother immediately. The woman was overweight, her posture defensive, her eyes downcast in a way Clara recognized instantly. She was trying to be invisible. Clara watched as the woman's husband and children made casual comments about her size, watched her flinch and shrink, watched the soldiers glance at her with familiar contempt, and Clara felt anger rise hot and fierce in her chest. She waited until the family had been assigned quarters, then sought out the woman, found her alone in the small room, unpacking with hands that shook. "Hello," Clara said gently from the doorway. "I'm Clara Blackwell. I wanted to welcome you to Silver Ridge." The woman turned and Clara saw tears on her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's kind of you. May I come in?" At the woman's nod, Clara entered and closed the door. She sat down on a wooden crate, took a breath, and began to speak. Not as a doctor or healer, but as someone who understood. "I know what you're feeling," Clara said quietly. "I know because 7 years ago I was you. I was the fat cook everyone mocked. The woman soldiers made pig noises at. The person who tried to be invisible because visibility meant pain." The woman stared at her, disbelief warring with desperate hope on her face. "But you're not, I'm still fat," Clara said bluntly. "I weigh about 240 pounds now. Had a baby 3 years ago and never lost the weight. Probably never will. But something changed that has nothing to do with my size." She told the story then. All of it. The years of cruelty, the mockery, the crushing weight of being invisible. Tobias appearing like an answer to prayer she hadn't known how to pray. The whip, standing up, everything that came after. "I'm not going to lie to you," Clara said when she finished. "People are cruel. They'll judge you. They'll say things that hurt. But here's what I learned. Their cruelty is about them, not you. Their inability to see your worth doesn't diminish your worth. You are valuable exactly as you are." The woman's face crumpled. "I don't feel valuable. My husband says I'm an embarrassment. My children are ashamed of me. Everyone looks at me like I'm disgusting." "Then they're wrong," Clara said with fierce certainty. "All of them. And you know what? You don't have to accept their verdict. You can decide for yourself who you are, what you're worth. And once you decide, once you really believe it, everything changes." She stood and moved to the door, then paused. "I run a clinic from my cabin, about 200 yards east of here. White cabin by the stream. You come see me anytime, day or night. If you need medical care, I'll provide it. If you just need someone to talk to who understands, I'm there. You're not alone anymore. I won't let you be." The woman wiped her eyes. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Clara smiled. "Because 7 years ago, a mountain man named Tobias helped me when he didn't have to. He saw me when I felt invisible. He gave me the tools to save myself. Now I'm paying that forward. That's how this works. Someone shows you it's possible to stand up. Then you show someone else. The circle keeps growing." She left the woman sitting there, but she'd planted a seed. And seeds, given time and care, grow into something stronger than anyone expects. Over the following months, the woman, whose name was Helen, became a regular visitor to Clara's cabin. At first, she came for medical treatment of her aching joints, her constant headaches, the physical toll of carrying extra weight in a world designed for smaller bodies. But gradually, the visits became about more than medicine. They talked about life, about pain, about the weight of other people's judgment, about learning to exist in a body the world considered wrong, about finding strength not despite that body but within it. Clara shared everything she'd learned, all the hard-won wisdom Tobias had given her, and she'd proven through living. "Your body isn't the problem," Clara told Helen one afternoon as they sat watching Ada play in the creek. "The problem is a world that measures worth by appearance instead of character, by taste instead of substance. But you can't change the world. You can only change how you respond to it." "How did you change?" Helen asked. Clara thought about it seriously. I stopped waiting for permission to exist. For 3 years, I tried to be invisible because I thought that was safer. It wasn't. It was just slower death. Then one day I had to choose between staying invisible and standing up for truth. I chose truth, and I discovered that being seen, really seen, was worth the risk. She turned to look at Helen. You're already seen. You can't make yourself invisible no matter how hard you try. So the question is, what do you want people to see when they look at you? A victim or someone who refused to be broken? Helen started attending Clara's shooting lessons. Yes, Clara had continued the practice Tobias started, teaching any woman at the fort who wanted to learn how to handle a weapon. It wasn't just about physical defense, though that mattered. It was about agency, about knowing you could protect yourself, that you weren't helpless. Watching Helen's confidence grow over the months was like watching time-lapse photography of a flower blooming. She stood straighter, looked people in the eye, spoke up when her husband made cruel comments, started saying no to treatment that diminished her. It wasn't easy and there were setbacks, but the trajectory was clear. Helen was finding herself, and she wasn't alone. Other women, inspired by Clara's story and Helen's transformation, began seeking out the cabin by the creek. They came with different struggles: abuse, poverty, loss, addiction, illness. But underneath, they all shared the same fundamental wound. The world had taught them they didn't matter, that they were less than, invisible or too visible, both equally painful. Clara treated them all with the same fierce compassion. She shared her story freely, offered practical help, taught survival skills, both physical and emotional. And slowly, a community formed. Women supporting women, helping each other stand when the weight felt too heavy to carry alone. One evening, 5 years after Ada's birth, Clara sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Tobias worked nearby, teaching 7-year-old Ada how to identify animal tracks in the mud by the creek. Their laughter floated on the evening air, bright and pure. Dr. Finch had passed away that spring, peacefully in his sleep, and had left Clara his entire medical library, along with a letter expressing his pride in what she'd become. Captain Hayes had officially designated her the fort physician, the first woman to hold that title in Montana Territory. Her clinic treated over 100 patients a month now, and just last week, she'd received a letter from a doctor in Boston asking if she'd consider writing a paper on frontier medicine for his journal. Clara Whitmore, the fat cook who'd spent 3 years invisible, was now Dr. Clara Blackwell, respected healer and teacher. How had it happened? One choice at a time, one moment of courage building on another. A figure approached from the fort, and Clara recognized Jimmy Chen's silhouette. He'd made captain now, commanded the entire garrison, and was engaged to marry a sweet school teacher from the nearby settlement. He waved as he drew near. "Evening, Mrs. Blackwell," he called. "Got a favor to ask." "Of course, Jimmy. What do you need?" He sat down on the porch steps, suddenly looking younger than his 26 years. "We're planning the wedding ceremony, and Sarah, my fiancée, she wants someone special to officiate, someone who means something to both of us. I was hoping you might do it." Clara blinked in surprise. "Me? But I'm not ordained. I'm not even particularly religious." "You don't need to be," Jimmy said earnestly. "You married Tobias and yourself in front of the fort 7 years ago, through your actions before you had an official ceremony. You showed us what commitment looks like, what love looks like. Sarah heard the story of how you took the whip, how you stood up for truth, and she said, that's who I want to marry us. Someone who understands what standing together really means." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I'd be honored." Jimmy smiled, then grew serious. "You changed my life, you know. Changed all of us. We were cruel, small people. You could have stayed bitter, could have left this place and never looked back. Instead, you stayed and showed us how to be better. That's a gift I can never repay." "You don't need to repay it," Clara said softly. "You just need to pass it forward. Be kind to people who feel invisible. See them. That's the legacy I want. Not gratitude, but continuation." After Jimmy left, Clara sat in the gathering darkness and thought about legacy, about how one moment of courage could ripple outward in ways you never imagined. She'd stood in front of a whip to save one man, but that action had saved so many more, had inspired Jimmy and others to see people differently. had created a community of women supporting each other, had shown Ada from birth that her mother was someone worth respecting. The chain of cause and effect stretched beyond her ability to trace, but Clara could feel it, could sense the weight of change spreading out from that single moment in the fort yard 7 years ago. Tobias came up the porch with Ada on his shoulders, both of them muddy and happy. "Found bear tracks by the creek," Ada announced proudly. "Papa says I can track it tomorrow if the weather holds." "We'll see," Clara said, reaching up to ruffle her daughter's hair. "Bears are dangerous." "Mama, you stood in front of a whip," Ada said with the devastating logic of children. "Papa says that's the bravest thing anyone ever did. If you can do that, I can track a bear." Tobias caught Clara's eye over their daughter's head, his expression a mixture of apology and pride. They'd told Ada the story, wanting her to understand where she came from, what her mother had done. But sometimes Clara worried the story set too high a bar. "Bravery isn't about taking big risks," Clara said carefully. "It's about taking the right risks, about standing up for truth even when it's hard, about seeing people who feel invisible. You don't need to do something dangerous to be brave, sweetheart. Sometimes the bravest thing is just being kind when others aren't." My Ada considered this seriously. "Like when I let Rebecca play with my toys even though she's mean sometimes?" "Exactly like that." "Then I'm brave every day," Ada declared with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old. Clara laughed and pulled her daughter down for a hug. "Yes, you are. The bravest girl I know." That night, after Ada was asleep and Tobias sat reading by lamplight, Clara stood at the window looking out over Silver Ridge. The fort glowed with lights, warm against the darkness. Beyond it, mountains rose black against starlit sky. This place that had once felt like a prison now felt like home. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 years ago. Fat, mocked, invisible. Thinking herself weak. Believing the cruelty directed at her reflected some fundamental unworthiness. She'd been so wrong about everything. The problem had never been her body, had never been her worth. The problem had been a world that didn't know how to value strength that came in unexpected packages. And she'd learned that you couldn't change that world by making yourself smaller. You changed it by standing up, by refusing to accept their verdict, by seeing your own worth clearly enough that their blindness didn't matter. More than that, she'd learned that survival wasn't enough, that being unseen was a kind of living death. She'd had to risk everything, had to step into visibility even knowing it might destroy her, because the alternative was disappearing completely. She'd taken that risk, and it had saved her life. Now, standing in her own home with her family nearby and her future stretching bright before her, Clara understood something fundamental. The whip had left a scar across her back, a permanent mark of that moment of choice. But scars weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of survival. Evidence that you'd been wounded and healed. That you'd faced pain and kept living. Her scar was a badge of honor, a reminder every morning when she dressed that she'd stood up when it mattered, that she'd chosen courage over comfort, truth over safety, visibility over invisibility. And in choosing that for herself, she'd made it possible for others to choose it too. Helen, who now ran a small bakery in the settlement and brooked no criticism from anyone. The women who came to her cabin seeking healing and found community instead. Jimmy and the other soldiers who'd learned to see people differently. Ada, who would grow up never doubting her own worth because she'd watched her mother claim hers. One moment, one choice. And the ripples continued spreading, touching lives Clara would never know about, changing a small corner of the world in ways that mattered. Tobias came to stand beside her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Legacy," Clara said softly. "About how one act of courage can change everything. About how being seen is worth the risk of being hurt." "You were always seen," Tobias murmured, "at least by me, from the very first moment." "I know, and that made all the difference." Clara turned in his arms to face him. "You gave me permission to see myself, to believe I was worth seeing. Without that, I never would have had the courage to stand up." "You gave yourself permission," Tobias corrected. "I just pointed out what was already there. The strength, the courage, the worth. You did the hard part. You believed it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their small piece of the world sleep. and Clara felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was happiness, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. Not perfection, but meaning. She'd spent 24 years feeling invisible, but she'd spent the last 7 years being gloriously, undeniably seen. And in being seen, she'd learned to see others, to look past surfaces to the struggling, hoping, hurting people underneath, to offer them the same gift Tobias had given her: recognition, acknowledgement, the simple but powerful message that they mattered. That was her legacy, not the cabin or the clinic or even the life she'd saved by taking a whip. Her legacy was teaching people to see each other, to look past the easy judgments and comfortable cruelties, to recognize that everyone, no matter how they looked or where they came from, deserved to be seen as fully human. It was a simple message, but simple didn't mean easy, and it didn't mean unimportant. Clara Whitmore had been invisible for 24 years. Clara Blackwell would never be invisible again. And in that transformation lay the seed of something greater. Not just one woman's redemption, but a quiet revolution. One that said, courage isn't found in the absence of fear, but in the choice to stand despite it. Worth isn't measured in pounds or beauty, but in the strength to keep living when the world tells you to disappear. She'd learned that lesson in blood and pain and fire. Now she would spend the rest of her life teaching it to anyone who needed to hear. One person at a time, one moment at a time, one act of seeing at a time. And it all started with a woman who refused to stay invisible, who stood in front of a whip, who chose courage over comfort and truth over safety, who taught a fort, a community, and eventually her own daughter. That strength comes in many forms. That beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That worth isn't measured in pounds or inches or any external standard. Worth is inherent. Courage is choosing to claim it. And legacy is passing that knowledge forward until everyone finally is seen.